They said it was just a joke, leaving me at the edge of the boardwalk with no way to get home. A joke. I remember the way the sun beat down on my face, sharp and unforgiving, while I sat there, stranded, my wheelchair nowhere in sight. It wasn't a small moment. It was the moment I realized how invisible I had become to my own family, how easily they could treat me like a piece of forgotten furniture, a decoration in their carefully staged lives. My name is Evelyn. I'm 76 years old, and I live alone now in a modest house not far from the coastline, where the sound of waves offers a kind of solace I never found indoors. The garden out back smells faintly of rosemary and salt, and I tend it with a patience I've learned only in these years of solitude. But it wasn't always this way. Not so long ago, I lived with my daughter, her husband, and my 2 grandsons in a house that was full of noise and little disasters, and the kind of tension you can't quite explain until it's too late. That house was my prison, disguised as a home. I thought I was there because of love, because family meant being together, sharing life. I was wrong. The truth is, I was there because I was a burden no one quite knew how to ask to leave. That day on the beach was the first time they really let me know how little I mattered. My wheelchair, the one I've depended on since my hip replacement 5 years ago, was taken away for a laugh. The boys, my grandsons, were supposed to be watching me, but instead they disappeared, giggling and daring each other to hide the chair behind the dunes while they went to get ice cream. When I realized I couldn't move, that the salty wind and hot sand were the only things keeping me company, I felt a cold twist in my chest. It wasn't just about the prank. It was the way no one looked back, the way my daughter shrugged when I asked where they'd gone, the way her smile didn't reach her eyes when she said, "Boys will be boys, Mom. You take things too seriously." I took things seriously because this was my life, not some game. But to them, I was a joke to be played on, a punchline waiting to be forgotten. Before that day, I had tried to hold on to my independence as best I could. I learned to live with the limits of age and injury without asking too much. I kept my appointments, managed my medications, and went to the grocery store on my own when I could. I wanted to be more than a patient, more than a burden. I wanted to be Evelyn, the woman who once raised a family, ran a small bookstore, and knew how to mend a fence and bake the best apple pie in the county. But somewhere along the way, that woman began to fade. They stopped asking for my advice, stopped inviting me to family dinners unless it was convenient. My suggestions were brushed aside, my opinions ignored. I was reduced to the caretaker of the grandchildren when no one else could. The occasional chauffeur, the designated babysitter, the unpaid help. I was always available, but never fully present. And when I stopped being useful, I stopped being wanted. It's a strange kind of loneliness, to live surrounded by family and still feel completely alone. My daughter's home was full of whispers and polite smiles, of glances exchanged over my head. My presence was tolerated, but only just. I remember the day they moved my medications from the kitchen counter to a locked cabinet. When I asked why, my daughter said it was for my own safety. But the tone was sharp, impatient. It wasn't about safety. It was about control. They decided what I could have and when. They watched as I struggled to open pill bottles, as I fumbled with buttons and keys, as I tried to prove that I was still capable. But capability was no longer the measure. It was compliance. And when I resisted, I was labeled difficult or confused. My money was another battleground. Over time, my daughter and son-in-law gradually took over the management of my bank accounts, telling me it was to help me avoid mistakes. I felt the walls closing in when I tried to pay for something myself, only to be stopped by a cashier who looked at me like I was making a scene. "Your daughter said to use her card," the clerk whispered. I was supposed to be grateful for their help, but all I felt was the sting of erasure. My identity was slipping through their fingers like grains of sand. I was no longer Evelyn, but an old woman whose decisions were made for her, whose voice was barely heard. The emotional weight of it all settled into my bones like a persistent ache. I felt invisible at family gatherings, overshadowed by the younger voices and busy schedules. The grandchildren's laughter sometimes felt like mockery when I caught the way their eyes darted away from mine. I was a shadow among them, a reminder of things best forgotten. The house was full of things I once loved. Bookshelves packed with novels I had read, photographs of my late husband, mementos from a life I had built. But they felt like relics, trapped in a time I no longer belonged to. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I would replay the day at the beach. The heat of the sun, the salty taste of tears I refused to shed, the sound of distant laughter that wasn't meant for me. I remembered reaching out for the wheelchair, the cool metal frame that wasn't there, and the sinking feeling that maybe this was how it would always be. Left behind, discarded, treated like a problem to be solved by ignoring it. I thought about how I used to be the center of my family's universe, how my advice was sought and valued. And now, I was the secret they whispered about, but never fully spoke aloud. Yet, despite it all, there is something stubborn in me that refuses to fade completely. I remember who I am, even if they have forgotten. I remember the long years of raising children, of late nights and early mornings, of sacrifices made without complaint. I remember the strength it took to stand on my own 2 feet, even when those feet trembled with age. And though I am weary, I have not given up. This story is not one of defeat. It is a quiet declaration that even when the world turns its back, the spirit can hold on. I am Evelyn, 76 years old, and I am still here. Alone, yes, but not lost. I live now in a small house where the walls don't echo with loneliness, but with memories reclaimed. The garden is my sanctuary, the daily ritual of tending plants a balm to my restless heart. I wake each morning to the sound of gulls and the smell of salt air, and in those moments, I feel a flicker of peace. The freedom is bittersweet, for it came at a price. But it is mine. I am not waiting for someone to come and save me anymore. I am learning to save myself. If you are listening, if you have ever felt the sting of being overlooked, of being the family secret, know this: your worth is not measured by their recognition. It is found in the quiet moments you claim for yourself, in the small acts of rebellion that remind you you are still here, still whole, still capable of choosing your own path. This is my story, but it could be yours, or hers, or theirs. The journey from invisibility to agency is slow and fraught with pain, but it is possible, and it is necessary. The day everything changed was wrapped in ordinary moments that suddenly cracked open like thin ice underfoot, revealing the cold water beneath. It began just like any other morning, with the hum of the old refrigerator and the faint scent of brewed coffee drifting through the kitchen. My daughter, Grace, was bustling around, getting the boys ready for the day's outing, their laughter echoing down the hall. I felt hopeful, naive perhaps, that maybe today would be different, that maybe they would see me, not as a burden, not as a joke, but as their mother and grandmother, the woman who had spent decades holding the family together. But hope is a fragile thing, and sometimes it breaks in silence. They had planned a trip to the beach. The sun was expected to shine, the tides to be gentle. It was supposed to be a family day, full of warmth and laughter, memories in the making. I was eager to go too, wanting to feel the sand beneath my feet and hear the waves in my ears. My wheelchair was charged and ready, the cushions fluffed, the basket packed with snacks and sunscreen. I was ready. But as we arrived at the boardwalk, something shifted in the air. A tension I couldn't name at the time, a quiet dismissal that settled over me like a shadow. The boys, my grandsons, James and Oliver, were restless and impatient. Their teenage energy brimming over, they teased and shoved each other, their voices loud and careless. At some point, they noticed my wheelchair, and a mischievous spark lit their eyes. "Let's hide Grandma's chair," James said with a grin. Oliver laughed and agreed. I watched, uncertain, as they slipped away, saying they were just playing around. I smiled weakly, trusting that they would be back quickly, that this was harmless fun. But the minutes stretched into a quarter of an hour, then half an hour. And still they did not return. The sun climbed higher, its heat pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. I called out softly at first, then louder, my voice tinged with panic I tried to hide. "James? Oliver? Where are you?" No answer came, only the distant cries of gulls and the rustling of waves. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, but the screen was cracked, and the battery was low. The thought that I might be left here, stranded and alone, sent a chill down my spine. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, a frantic rhythm of fear and disbelief. How could they have forgotten me? How could they have thought this was a game? When my daughter finally noticed my distress, she gave a quick, dismissive glance. "Mom, stop overreacting," she said, her tone sharp and impatient. "They just went to get ice cream. They'll be right back." Her words rang hollow in my ears, like a cruel echo in an empty room. I wanted to believe her, to trust in the family I had nurtured all these years. But the sun was merciless, and my skin burned beneath its gaze. I sat there, exposed, vulnerable, a woman left behind. The time crawled by with agonizing slowness. Passers-by glanced at me with mild curiosity, but no real concern. Some offered a polite smile, others hurried past, avoiding eye contact. I was an obstacle, a fixture to be ignored. My legs ached from staying still, my hands ached from gripping the cold rail beside me. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but I was too proud, too scared of what that call might mean. Pride is a complicated thing for a woman like me, tied up in decades of dignity and the quiet hope that my family would protect me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James and Oliver appeared at the end of the boardwalk, their faces flushed and apologetic, but tinged with laughter. They hadn't thought it through, they said. It was just a joke, a prank to make me laugh. But the laughter died in their eyes when they saw the sunburn on my arms, the tears that had quietly tracked down my cheeks, the way my hands shook. The chair was there too, abandoned behind a dune, half buried in sand. They hadn't cared. Not really. That evening, back at the house, the hurt simmered beneath polite conversation and forced smiles. I tried to tell Grace how it felt to be left alone, how the joke cut deeper than any words. But she brushed me off with a sigh and said, You take things too seriously, Mom. The boys didn't mean anything by it. You have to learn to let go, to laugh with us, not at yourself. Her words hit me harder than the sun ever could. To be told my pain was a joke, that my feelings were an inconvenience, was a wound far deeper than any physical bruise. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about all the times I had been asked to let go, to be easier, to not make a fuss. The quiet moments when I was told I was too sensitive, too old-fashioned, too much trouble. The way I had been slowly edged out of conversations, decisions, the very life I helped build. I realized then that this prank was not just a moment of thoughtlessness, but a symbol of something much larger, the way I had been erased, one small betrayal at a time. The days that followed brought more signs of the subtle but relentless loss of my autonomy. My daughter's tone became colder, her patience thinner. The boundaries around me tightened as if I were a fragile object to be protected from myself. My pills were rearranged without explanation. My phone was occasionally taken away to keep me safe. My movements were monitored, my opinions dismissed. It was a slow suffocation, a shrinking of my world into a cage I had not chosen. And yet, beneath the surface of this growing despair, a spark began to flicker. The pain and humiliation ignited a quiet resolve within me. If they thought I would disappear quietly, forgotten and defeated, they were mistaken. That day on the boardwalk when they left me behind was the catalyst. It shattered the illusion that I belonged in a place where I was not wanted, where my dignity was a punchline. From that moment on, I knew I had to reclaim something precious, myself. It was a long, difficult journey to that realization. There were moments of doubt and exhaustion, times when I questioned if I had the strength to stand up and fight for my own worth. But every small act of dismissal, every whispered insult disguised as concern, only fueled my determination. I began to keep a small notebook, jotting down incidents, feelings, moments that made me feel less than human. I found a community center that offered legal advice for seniors and started to attend, learning that I was not alone, that others had faced similar betrayals and found ways to reclaim their lives. The family I once knew was still there, but the roles had shifted irreversibly. They no longer saw me as a mother or grandmother, but as an obstacle to their carefully managed lives. The prank with the wheelchair was a symptom, a glimpse into the cold reality beneath the surface of family love. It was a reminder that sometimes those closest to us are capable of the greatest betrayals. But I was no longer willing to be silent. That day was the beginning of my fight to be seen, to be respected, to be treated with the dignity I had earned. It was the moment I stopped waiting for them to notice me and started noticing myself again. It was the first step on a path toward reclaiming my freedom and my life. After the day on the beach when they left me stranded, things didn't explode into open conflict as one might expect. Instead, the changes came quietly, like a slow tide eroding the shoreline, imperceptible at first, but inevitable in its power. I found myself living in a world that was shrinking around me, not because of my own limitations, but because of the way my family began to reshape my existence without asking. It wasn't dramatic. There were no shouted arguments or slammed doors. There were only small, persistent acts that chipped away at the life I once knew and the dignity I had fought to keep intact. The first sign of this gradual decline was the subtle rearrangement of my daily routines. My medications, which I had always managed myself with care and precision, were moved from the kitchen counter to a locked cabinet in the pantry. When I asked my daughter, Grace, why, she said it was for my safety, that I might accidentally take the wrong pills or miss a dose. Her voice was soft but firm, the kind of tone people use when they believe they are doing the right thing, but don't want to be questioned. I tried to protest, to explain that I had been managing my medications for years without incident. But her eyes told me this was not a conversation she wanted to have. It was easier for her, and for everyone, to take control than to trust me to take care of myself. With my medications came other small controls. My wallet, once mine to use freely, began to go missing with increasing frequency. At first, it was always found in some odd place, under a cushion, inside the refrigerator, wedged between books on the shelf. I assumed I was simply misplacing things, as anyone might in their 70s. But the truth became clear when I noticed that certain bills in my bank card were no longer where I left them. When I asked about it, Grace smiled in a way that was meant to soothe but felt patronizing. "Mom, you don't need to worry about money anymore. Let me handle it." The words were meant to be comforting, but they sounded more like a sentence. It was a slow stripping away of my autonomy, dressed up as care and concern. This erosion extended into my movements within the house and beyond. My son-in-law, Mark, began commenting more frequently on the burden of caregiving, always carefully phrased so as not to seem callous, but sharp enough to sting. "It's a lot of work to keep Mom safe these days," he said once when Grace and I were in the kitchen. "You don't want her falling or wandering off." I could feel the accusation in the air, as if I were already suspecting their intentions. I was no longer a person, but a liability. Someone whose needs outweighed their desires. Their home became a place of rules and restrictions, where my independence was measured and limited in increments that suited them. The technology in the house became another means of control. They installed a new security system, complete with cameras in the common areas. "It's for your protection," Grace assured me, though I could tell from her expression that it was as much about keeping an eye on me as anything else. The cameras felt like eyes that never blinked, watching for signs of weakness or confusion, waiting for the moment when I might slip up. My phone was often taken to charge in the living room, out of my reach for hours at a time. It was a subtle way of cutting me off from the outside world, from any chance of reaching out or making a spontaneous decision. When I asked for it back, I was met with excuses, low battery, or that Grace needed it for a call. And I learned quickly not to press. The emotional toll of these changes was immense. I began to feel invisible in my own home, surrounded by people who saw me less and less as a person and more as a project or a problem to be managed. My opinions were dismissed with polite nods. My requests for privacy or space met with practical reminders of how things are now. I remember one evening when I tried to tell Grace that I wanted to take a short walk alone around the block, just to breathe and feel the air on my face without being watched. She shook her head firmly and said, "It's not safe, Mom. You don't know what could happen out there." The words were wrapped in concern, but I heard the underlying message loud and clear. You don't belong outside my supervision anymore. Even the small joys of my past life began to fade. The books I loved, once stacked neatly on shelves within easy reach, were moved to a high cabinet to prevent accidents. The knitting supplies I used to pass time with were boxed away because they were messy. The photos of my husband and children that I kept on the mantel were covered with dust cloths during cleaning, as if to hide the past from view. It felt like I was being erased from the narrative of the family, replaced by a quieter, more manageable version of myself that was easier to control. The worst moments were the silences, and the glances I couldn't quite interpret. When I expressed frustration or sadness, I was often met with sighs or the quick change of subject. Once, when I tried to explain how lonely I felt, Grace said, "Mom, we all have our struggles. You just have to be stronger." Her words were meant to encourage, but they sounded like a dismissal, a refusal to acknowledge the depth of my pain. I realized then that my feelings were inconvenient, something to be pushed aside rather than understood. There were times when I caught the boys sneering behind their mother's back, their eyes rolling when I entered the room. They whispered among themselves about how Grandma was slow or always complaining, laughing in ways that cut deeper than any harsh word spoken aloud. They didn't realize I could hear, or perhaps they didn't care. Their laughter was a reminder that the prank on the beach was not an isolated event, but part of a larger pattern of disrespect. I began to withdraw. It was easier to sit quietly in a corner than to face the constant reminders that I was no longer valued. The house felt like a gilded cage, beautiful but confining. I stopped asking for things, stopped voicing my opinions. I became a shadow, blending into the background, hoping to avoid the sharp edges of their impatience. But even in silence, the ache inside me grew. The loneliness was not just the absence of company, but the absence of connection, the feeling of being present, but unseen. My body bore the weight of this emotional burden. The stiffness in my joints seemed to worsen. The pains that age brought were magnified by stress and sadness. Sleep became elusive, filled with restless tossing and dreams I couldn't remember, but woke from with a heaviness in my chest. I found myself waking early, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had come to this place where my own family treated me as less than I was. One day, I discovered a letter tucked under my pillow. It was from Grace, written in a hurried hand. The note was short, almost cold. "We are doing what's best for you. Please trust us and stop causing trouble." It was signed simply, "Love, Grace." I folded the paper slowly, the words feeling like a verdict rather than an expression of love. Trust them. Stop causing trouble. The message was clear. My needs, my voice, my presence, all of it was a problem. But beneath the surface of that despair, a small flame of resistance kindled. I realized that if I continued to accept this diminishing of my personhood, I would disappear entirely. I began to hold on to moments of quiet rebellion, a phone call made in secret, a letter read and reread, a walk taken when no one was watching. I kept a journal, writing down the little indignities, the moments when I felt most invisible, and the rare times when I felt seen. It was my way of asserting that I still existed, still mattered, still had a story worth telling. This first escalation was not marked by dramatic confrontations, but by a slow and steady unraveling of everything I had once known as my life. It was a silent war, fought in the spaces between words and in the absence of gestures. It was the moment when care became control, love became neglect, and family became strangers under the same roof. And yet, even as the walls closed in, I began to understand that this was not the end of my story. It was a turning point, a painful but necessary step toward reclaiming my agency and my voice. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but the seed of change had been planted. I would find a way to rise from the quiet erosion and stand again as the woman I was always meant to be. The moment I began to change was not marked by a grand revelation or an angry outburst, but by a quiet, almost imperceptible shift deep within me. A small flame kindled by years of fading into the background, finally sparking a desire to reclaim what had been quietly taken away. It started with a decision to stop being passive, to no longer accept the roles others had written for me without consent. I realized that waiting for my family to see me, to respect me, was like waiting for the tide to turn on its own. It might come, but I needed to start moving if I wanted to be part of the change. It was the first time in a long time I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose beyond survival. I began by hiding a small set of keys to my own freedom. They weren't grand or symbolic in the eyes of others, just the spare keys to my apartment and a box where I kept important papers. But to me, they represented autonomy. Keeping them secret was a subtle rebellion, a way to hold on to control in a life that felt increasingly controlled by others. It was a small act, but it felt monumental. The same way a bird might cautiously test its wings after a long winter, I was beginning to prepare myself for flight. At the community center, where I started attending weekly sessions, I found a space that was both foreign and familiar, a room filled with other seniors who carried stories of loss, neglect, and quiet battles for dignity. The legal aid workshops were enlightening and empowering. I learned that what I was experiencing wasn't unusual, that many elderly people faced similar challenges from family members who, whether intentionally or not, crossed lines of respect and care. For the first time, I began to understand the language of rights, boundaries, and legal protections. I began to see that independence wasn't just a memory, but something that could be fought for and regained. Alongside this newfound knowledge, I started to document everything. A battered notebook became my confidant. I wrote down the incidents that left me feeling diminished, the casual comments that cut deeper than any harsh word, the moments when I was ignored or sidelined. Writing helped me make sense of the tangled emotions that swirled inside me: anger, sadness, fear, but also a growing strength. Each entry was a small act of reclaiming my story, a refusal to let it be rewritten without my voice. One afternoon, as I sat by the window of the community center, the light filtering through the dusty glass casting soft patterns on my hands, I realized how much I had been erased from my own life. The realization was painful, but clarifying. I was no longer just a mother or grandmother in the eyes of my family. I had become an inconvenience, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. But I wasn't ready to accept that fate. Not yet. I decided that I would no longer wait for permission to be myself. This shift was not without its challenges. When I began to push back, even in small ways, the responses from my family ranged from confusion to frustration, and sometimes outright anger. Grace didn't understand why I needed to attend these workshops or why I kept a journal. She accused me of making things worse, of being too sensitive and creating problems where there were none. Mark's warnings became more frequent, cautioning me to pick my battles and not rock the boat. The boys, too, seemed unsettled by my growing assertiveness, their teasing becoming more pointed, their jokes less playful. But despite the resistance, I felt something stirring inside me that I hadn't felt in years. Hope. It wasn't the naive hope of before, the hope that others would change for me, but a steady, quiet hope rooted in my own actions. I began taking small steps outside the confines of my family's control. I started going to the library on my own, reconnecting with books and stories that had once been my refuge. I volunteered to shelve books and help with community events. Each interaction was a reminder that I still had a place in the world beyond the walls that had closed around me. Purchasing a coat was another symbolic act in this unfolding transformation. It wasn't an extravagant garment, just a navy wool coat with a subtle herringbone pattern and deep pockets. But it fit me like a promise. When I put it on, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was as if the fabric itself held the stories of resilience, of survival, of quiet rebellion. The coat became a shield and a statement, a daily reminder that I was reclaiming my dignity piece by piece. Wearing it on my walks through the neighborhood, I felt the eyes of strangers, some curious, some kindly, but none dismissive. For once, I was seen, not as an object of pity, but as a woman who still mattered. My friendship with Joyce, the woman who rented me a room, deepened during this time. She was a rough-edged but fiercely loyal companion, a woman who didn't ask questions she didn't want answered and didn't offer advice unless asked. Joyce became a witness to my quiet rebellion and, in her own way, a partner in it. We shared meals, stories, and the comforting rituals of daily life. Her acceptance was a balm to the wounds left by family indifference. Through these changes, I began to understand the difference between survival and living. For so long, I had been surviving, enduring the pain, the humiliation, the invisibility. But now I was beginning to live again, to find moments of joy, of connection, of meaning. The transformation was neither fast nor easy, but it was real. It was a reclamation of self that no one could take away. I kept my phone off most of the time, wrapped in a clean handkerchief and tucked away in a drawer. The silence was a refuge, a way to protect the fragile new life I was building. I was not yet ready to face the voices of my family, the demands and disappointments that came with their calls. For now, I was focusing on me, the woman beneath the layers of expectation and neglect. The shift at the midpoint of my story was not a sudden leap, but a series of small, deliberate steps. It was the choice to stop waiting for permission and to start making decisions for myself. It was the moment when I began to move from victim to agent, from silence to voice. It was the beginning of the journey toward freedom. Not the freedom of leaving behind my family out of anger, but the freedom to be seen and respected as the woman I am. I don't pretend that the path ahead is without obstacles. There will be moments of doubt, of loneliness, of confrontation. But in that shift, I found a foundation to stand on, a belief in my own worth and a determination to reclaim my life, one step at a time. The coat hanging by my door is more than fabric. It is a symbol of that shift, a tangible reminder that change is possible, even when the world around you tries to tell you otherwise. And so, in the quiet of my small room, surrounded by the hum of a city that doesn't know my name, I began to write a new story. One where I am not invisible, not a joke, not a burden. One where I am Evelyn, a woman who, despite everything, is still here, still standing, still choosing herself. The second escalation came without warning, yet it felt inevitable, like the slow darkening of the sky before a storm breaks, just when I had begun to settle into the fragile peace of my new life. When I was finally learning to breathe without the weight of expectation pressing down on my chest, the past came rushing back, uninvited and relentless. It arrived not with open arms or apologies, but with the cold edge of confrontation, the harsh reminder that family, for all its promises, can also be the fiercest battleground. It began subtly enough with a letter that arrived one gray morning slipped under my door. The envelope was thick and heavy, the handwriting unmistakable, my daughter's, sharp and neat, full of words that felt more like accusations than pleas. I read it carefully, each sentence a calculated blow dressed in concern. She wrote about how worried they were, about how my disappearance was causing stress and confusion in the family. The letter spoke of their desire to talk, to reconcile, but only if I was ready to be reasonable. The word reasonable hung in the air like a challenge, a test I was not sure I wanted to pass. The letter contained no admission of fault, no recognition of the months of neglect or the humiliation I had endured. It was a performance of concern, scripted for an audience of onlookers who could never see the real story beneath the polished words. That letter was followed quickly by a visit I hadn't expected. Lisa, my daughter-in-law, came to the cafe where I worked. She stood stiffly by the pastry display, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for a way out of the awkwardness that settled between us like an unwelcome guest. She tried to speak softly, to keep the tone light, but there was a hardness beneath her words. "We were panicked," she said, her voice low. "The boys were upset. The flight was boarding, and we thought you were behind us. We didn't mean to hurt you." Her apology was a threadbare thing, worn thin by repeated use and lacking the warmth I needed to hear. I let her speak, letting the silence stretch between us, a taut line of unspoken truths. When she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, I took it without enthusiasm. It was money, an attempt to smooth things over, to buy silence and compliance. I held the envelope for a moment before placing it on the counter. "Kieran doesn't need a go-between," I said quietly. "He knows how to call." Her face softened then, just a little, revealing the exhaustion beneath the polished facade. "He might," she admitted, "but I worry." The worry sounded hollow, rehearsed, but I didn't press. I stood and told her I was not the shadow she feared, but a woman who had learned to stand in her own light. She left without finishing her coffee, the empty cup a silent witness to a conversation that left us both unfulfilled. Meanwhile, the community around me stirred. Someone at the cafe left a newspaper clipping on the counter one morning, and Heather, my supervisor, handed it to me with a quiet question in her eyes. The headline read, "Missing Matriarch. Family Speaks Out on Grandmother's Disappearance." The photo was one from years ago, taken at a family gathering. A smile frozen in time that no longer matched the woman reading the words beneath it. The article quoted Adam, my son, talking about his deep concern and the stress our family had endured. Lisa's voice was there too, warning of my vulnerability and pleading for anyone who saw me to get in touch. The absurdity of it all made me laugh, a harsh, startled sound that echoed too loudly in the quiet cafe. Vulnerable. That was the word they chose to describe me, the woman who had stood strong through loss, betrayal, and years of neglect. Vulnerable, as if I were fragile glass to be handled with caution rather than a force to be reckoned with. Heather didn't ask questions. She just nodded and went back to work. I kept the clipping, not as a trophy, but as evidence that concern often arrives only when control slips away. The backlash was not limited to words and visits. My phone, the one I had finally begun to turn on again, began to ring relentlessly. Calls from Lisa, from Adam, from numbers I recognized, but wasn't ready to answer. Voicemails filled with urgency, guilt, anger, and pleading. One message from Lisa accused me of punishing the family, of taking things too far, of causing pain that could never be undone. Another from Adam was terse and sharp, demanding to know where I was and warning that the charade needed to end. The tension in their voices was a mixture of frustration and fear. Fear of losing control, frustration at my refusal to return to the role they had assigned me. I listened to the messages, but did not respond. Not yet. I was still gathering my strength, still learning how to protect the fragile life I was building from the storm their voices threatened to unleash. One day, Arthur, my quiet friend from the cafe, noticed the weight I carried. His eyes were gentle but concerned when he asked, "What's troubling you?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "They're trying to pull me back," I said finally, the words tasting like bitterness. He nodded slowly, understanding more than I said. "Sometimes the past has long arms," he said, "but you don't have to let it drag you down." His presence was a balm, a reminder that I was not alone in this struggle. The legal threats escalated as well. Adam hired a lawyer, Derek Sorensen, a man who showed up at the cafe one afternoon with a carefully measured tone and a stack of papers. He spoke of concern, safety, and next steps to ensure my well-being and protect my assets. I listened to his words, the calm professionalism masking the underlying intent to control and constrain. When he suggested that I consider moving to a care facility or discuss arrangements for my finances, I folded my apron and told him firmly, "Tell Adam I'm not a pet to be managed." There are no next steps unless I choose them. He left blinking in the sunlight, unaccustomed to resistance from someone his age and position. Arthur was waiting outside when I stepped out, his face unreadable. "You okay?" he asked simply. "I am," I said, "because I'm not going to let anyone convince me I'm not." In the midst of this, Kieran, my oldest grandchild, remained a fragile bridge to my family's heart. His letters were different. Gentle, sincere, free of blame or expectation. "I miss you," he wrote. "I'm coming to see you alone, if you want." That message was a lifeline, a whisper of hope that all was not lost. Our reunion was quiet, marked by the hesitance of two people relearning how to hold space for each other without the weight of the past. He did not ask if I was returning home, nor did I ask if he would stay. We simply existed in that fragile moment of connection, a small act of love that neither of us took for granted. The pressures from my family did not cease, but they no longer frightened me as they once had. I had learned to stand firm, to speak clearly and calmly. When I received their letters and calls, I considered my responses carefully. I chose silence when words would feed their need for control. I chose presence in the cafe and in my community when they sought to erase me. I chose myself. One night, I wrote a letter to Lisa, not an angry one, but a letter of finality and clarity. "I know what you did," I wrote. "I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. Take care of your own life now." It was brief, precise, a boundary set in ink. The next morning, I mailed it with a stamp bearing a finch, a small bird known for singing even in the cold. The act of sending that letter was more than words on paper. It was a reclaiming of voice and power. In the weeks that followed, I continued to build my new life. I worked at the cafe, tended my garden, and nurtured the friendships I had found. The past came knocking sometimes, in the form of letters, visits, and the ever-present media attention sparked by my disappearance. But I met it with quiet strength. When Derek Sorensen called again, I wrote a letter of my own, a legal notice declaring my sound mind, my safe environment, and my refusal of further contact. It was a final cut, a closing of one chapter and the opening of another. Through it all, I discovered that freedom is not the absence of ties, but the presence of choice. I chose to be here in this small house, with my friends and the life I had carved out. I chose to be more than a shadow or a punchline. I chose to be myself, fully and unapologetically. The second escalation tested me, pushed me to the edges of despair and defiance. It revealed the true nature of those who claimed to love me and showed me the depth of my own resilience. And in that crucible, I found a clarity that no family drama could obscure. I was no longer waiting for them to recognize my worth. I was claiming it for myself. The climax of my story was not a thunderous confrontation or a public spectacle, but a quiet, deliberate act that marked the irrevocable turning point in my life. It was the moment when I took back control, not through words, not through anger, but through a simple gesture that spoke louder than any argument or plea. It was the moment I stopped being the object of their control and became the subject of my own story. For months, the weight of their demands, their expectations, and their attempts to draw me back into a life I had left behind pressed heavily on my shoulders. The calls, the letters, the visits, the lawyer's shadow lurking at the edges of my new existence. They were all attempts to tether me to a role I no longer wished to play. I had tried to meet them with calmness, with patience, with measured responses. But there came a point when I realized that words were not enough, that silence was not protection, and that the only way to truly reclaim myself was through action. It happened one afternoon during a family barbecue held at my daughter's home. The air was thick with summer heat and the smell of grilled meat and sweetened drinks. The laughter was loud and careless, the kind that fills a yard with energy, but can also drown out quiet voices. I was there, but I felt more like a spectator than a participant. They had invited me, perhaps out of obligation, perhaps out of hope that I would resume the place they wanted me to occupy. But the invitation felt like a cage disguised as kindness. I sat in the corner, my wheelchair parked beside me, watching as my grandsons ran past, shouting and pushing each other, their joy unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. Lisa moved among the guests, her smile practiced and eyes sharp, making sure everything was just so. Grace hovered near the grill, exchanging polite nods with neighbors and friends. Mark was distant, his gaze flickering toward me more than once, as if trying to gauge my mood. The moment came when I saw the car keys lying unattended on the patio table. They were shiny and new, a symbol of freedom and movement that had been denied to me for far too long. Without a word, without hesitation, I reached out and took them. The air seemed to still around me, the voices and laughter fading into the background. I rolled my wheelchair to the edge of the yard, the cool grass brushing against my wheels. There was a flash of surprise on Grace's face when she noticed what I had done, quickly replaced by a mixture of shock and indignation. "Mom, what are you doing?" she demanded, stepping toward me. But I did not answer. I lifted my arm and, with a steady hand, hurled the keys toward the storm drain at the edge of the property. The metal clinked as it fell, swallowed by the darkness below. A silence fell over the gathering, thick and heavy. The grandsons stopped mid-chase, turning to look at me with wide eyes. Lisa's mouth opened, then closed, unable to find words. Mark's face darkened, and Grace looked as if she wanted to say something harsh, but held herself back. I felt the weight of their gazes, but did not flinch. I was no longer the woman who waited silently for permission or approval. I was the woman who had taken back her power in the most simple, irrevocable way. That night, after the guests had left and the house had quieted, I sat at the kitchen table with a letter I had prepared in secret. It was addressed not to my family, but to Derek Sorensen, the lawyer who had become the embodiment of their attempts to control me. My hand was steady as I wrote, each word chosen with care and finality. I declared that I was of sound mind, living in a safe environment and not under duress. I revoked any previous authorizations regarding my assets and stated clearly that any further contact under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. I signed the letter and sealed it with a calm that surprised even me. Sending that letter was an act of liberation. It was a declaration that I was no longer willing to be managed, monitored, or manipulated. It was the end of their control and the beginning of my sovereignty. The next morning, I dropped it at the post office with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has finally reclaimed their voice after years of silence. In the days that followed, the family's reactions were mixed. There was anger, disbelief, and attempts to negotiate. But I stood firm. I did not engage with their pleas or protests. Instead, I focused on building the life I wanted, a life defined by my choices, my rhythms, and my dignity. I returned to the cafe, to my garden, to the friendships that had become my refuge. I wore my navy coat with pride, a symbol of the woman I had become. The climax was not a moment of vengeance, but one of grace and strength. I did not seek to punish, but to proclaim that I was no longer a possession to be passed around or a problem to be solved. I was a person, a woman with a history, a spirit, and a right to self-determination. That night, as I lay in my small room, the sounds of the city humming softly outside my window, I felt a peace I had not known in years. The storm had passed, and I was standing in the calm it left behind. The keys lost to the storm drain were more than metal. They were the last chains broken, the final step toward freedom. I realized then that reclaiming my power did not mean severing all ties, but redefining them on my terms. It meant choosing who to let in and when, what to accept and what to refuse. It meant understanding that love cannot be demanded or coerced, but must be given freely, with respect. The climax of my journey was this quiet act of throwing those keys away. It was a gesture both literal and symbolic, marking the moment when I took my life back, when I said, without words, I am no longer yours to control. It was the moment when Evelyn, the woman who had been silenced and diminished for too long, stood, tall again, steady, strong, and free. They say time heals all wounds, but I have learned that healing is not something that simply happens. It is something you choose to make happen, piece by piece, day by day. After the storm of betrayal, confrontation, and reclamation, there settled a quiet peace in my life, a peace born not from forgetting, but from accepting and moving forward on my own terms. Living alone now in my small house near the sea, surrounded by the scent of basil and rosemary in my garden, I have found a rhythm that is mine alone, a rhythm that carries the sound of waves and the soft rustle of pages in books I read without hurry or permission. The freedom I fought for has not come without cost. Relationships have been altered, some broken, others left stretched thin like fragile threads in a tapestry. But the most important relationship, the one with myself, has been mended and strengthened. I have learned to be my own guardian, my own advocate, and my own source of comfort. The lipstick I wear, the navy coat that wraps me like a shield, these are not just accessories, but symbols of my renewed dignity and self-respect. Each morning, I greet myself in the mirror with a quiet smile, reminding the woman who once sat abandoned on a sunlit boardwalk that she is still here, still whole, and still worthy. Volunteering at the community library has become a sanctuary, a place where I am valued not for my past roles or family ties, but for the person I am now. The friendships I have formed there are genuine and reciprocal, free from the complicated power dynamics of family. Here, I am not invisible. I am seen, heard, and appreciated. I often think of the younger women I meet, women who might one day face the same invisibility, neglect, or betrayal that I endured. To them, I offer my story as a quiet warning and a beacon of hope. If you are reading this, feeling lost, unseen, or diminished by those who should love you, know this: your worth is not defined by their acceptance or neglect. It is found within you, in the steady beat of your own heart, and the small acts of courage you choose each day. You do not have to wait for permission to be yourself, to reclaim your voice, or to live with dignity. Sometimes, the greatest love you will ever know is the love you give yourself. I do not pretend my journey is over. Life continues to present challenges, moments of doubt, and the echoes of past pain. But I face them now with the quiet strength that comes from knowing I have stood up, taken back my keys, and thrown away the chains of invisibility. I have learned that freedom is not just a place but a state of mind, a choice to live authentically despite the obstacles. The house may be small and the garden modest, but they are mine. And in this space of my own making, I have found peace. It is a peace born of resilience, born of refusal to be erased. It is the peace of a woman who has walked through fire and come out the other side, not unscathed, but unbroken. So to any woman who feels like I once did, forgotten, dismissed, and alone, I say, hold on to your story, cherish your truth, and take your own keys when no one else will give them to you. The path may be hard and the journey long, but on the other side is a life lived fully and freely on your own terms. And that, my dear, is worth everything.